Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. Such a pleasure today to be here with the Reverend Dr. David Moore, who, if you're around Santa Barbara, you've definitely heard him, seen him, read his work. He's a theologian, he's a pastor, human rights leader, writer, so many great things in this community. And I'm super looking forward to having this conversation to talk about what's going on nationally, politics, local politics, community, and just getting to share Dr. Moore's mind and his brilliance with our audience. Dr. Moore, how are you doing today?
I'm good. And Josh, I want to thank you for the multiple ways that you do what you're doing right now, and that is participate in and host conversations because that's vital to living in community. So yeah, thank you for being you.
Thank you. I appreciate that greatly. I wanted to just dive right in and talk to you. Obviously, we're coming off the presidential election and the election of Donald Trump to the seat. And this is his second time he's been elected president after a break in the middle. And, the first time he won, there was a lot of surprise. People could not
Yeah.
believe that he could beat Hillary Clinton. And the polls ahead of time had indicated Clinton was going to win. And this time we know so much more about him. And this time with his election, there's so much anger and outrage, particularly among us, people who live in Santa Barbara, in California, and the Central Coast. If you look at the maps across the nation, it's more red in the middle. So obviously, he was elected, he has support, but so many fears, mass deportations, women's reproductive rights, health care, public education. There's so many fears and concerns that now that he's in office, he's going to be worse than he ever was. I wanted to talk to you. What is your perspective on Trump? How did he win? Why did he win? And how do we react to this situation?
Well, Josh, I mean, I think that's a question that millions and millions of people are asking right now. So it's only right that you would, you know, introduce that to a conversation right at the top here. Um, I think that we actually, as a society, intentionally voted for pandemonium. Um, I don't think everybody necessarily had the same motivations to vote for pandemonium, but that's what we did. Some people out of frustration, some people out of being ill-informed or disinformed, um, some people out of hate and fear and spite. There may have been a number of motivations, but that's really what we as a society chose to do.
And so let's look at that a little bit. How is it? I mean, I'll just ask you this question because I try to answer it. I have kids, I try to answer it.
Yeah.
People, I have students, they ask me this. Why would somebody vote for Trump? For somebody who wants to do all of the things that he says he wants to do and come out from a place of division. It's, most of our you look at a Barack Obama, for example, most of the leaders are unifiers, right? They're people who want to bridge us and bring us together. And we may doubt them or we may not agree they'll be effective and all of that. But how is it that somebody who's so divisive is the choice?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that there is this lust for pandemonium.
Mhm.
I think the pandemonium is a way to disrupt um, what people feel is in many ways hopeless, and they feel like they can do something about it by creating chaos. And that's who we have. We have a president elect who is an engineer of chaos. And again, that's not everybody's motivation who voted for him. If you are a billionaire, your motivations would be different. I mean, you would take him at his word, that he will amplify, fossil fuels, that he will give tax cuts, that he will, he'll have tariffs. He'll change the whole format of the way tariffs are implemented, and yet that's not the same motivation necessarily that your lower class, lower middle class, low income person would have for voting for Trump. Um, they see a value perhaps in chaos because they don't see a future. I think that we've been hearing conversations of late of how um, people who are not well educated feel excluded. They feel like elites are their enemies. And when I say elites, I'm talking about people with bachelor's degrees, right? Which most of us would not necessarily lump, with elites, but if you barely got a GED and you feel like people are talking down to you, then this is not breaking news. You know this. This is why a lot of people are moved to do something because they feel powerless, and so to vote for Donald Trump is an exercise of power on their part.
Mhm. Exactly. There was that Bernie Sanders statement that he put out, and we've seen a lot of the analysis of what went wrong. And so it's easier to see now or discuss now because he's won. But what do you think? There's so much talk about the Democratic Party abandoning working class people
Yeah,
and being out of touch with the basic needs, economic needs, job needs, workforce
yeah,
needs of working people, and spending a lot of time on more of the cultural sort of social justice, equity issues, and a lot of people who are in the grind just trying to manage a family or be in a family and pay the rent. They don't have time for those discussions. They have time for how are we going to survive this week? And Bernie Sanders put that out there, of course. And there's a lot of analysis saying that the party, the National Party, and the Biden administration and Kamala Harris was just kind of out of touch with what working class people are talking about. Is there any
yeah.
truth to that?
Uh, Josh, I think all of the above.
Yeah,
And I think that there's a pretty sizable nexus of a lot of people talking about that in different ways.
yeah.
Um, but maybe we should talk about what's not being talked about, hasn't been talked about, and may not be talked about for a while. And that is the impact of an ongoing genocide and what it has done to mute our screaming conscience, what it has done to inject madness into our society. Because what's going on in Gaza, it is it stirs up our country's historical memory and the shame that comes with that memory. Notice at the end here, at the end of the Biden administration, wonderfully, he goes to apologize to indigenous Americans for the boarding schools that they were forced to attend and to abandon their cultures to.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something to applaud, and Deb Haaland is to be recognized there. There are people, indigenous people who did celebrate that. Some would not necessarily were completely enthused about it. But the thing is that let's take this, let's break this down. Biden's in office for 4 years before he takes this action. But from day one, he is Israel's ally. He's on the side of genocide while apologizing for genocide. This is madness. And it's really reflective of the society that we are in. It doesn't make sense. And it's not going to make sense as long as we keep trying to follow this same storyline.
Hmm. There's so many inconsistencies when you sort of try to connect the dots of logic of why our country does what it does or says what it does. It's like well, how come this logic applies over here in this nation, but not in this nation? And
Yeah.
and that's pretty clear. You talked about it, and I've covered you at speaking at some of the rallies where you've talked about what's happening in Gaza. So let's just go there. What impact, what role do you think people who were so dissatisfied with the American government's role in Gaza
Yeah.
and they just said, we're not voting for Kamala Harris, even though she's liberal, she's a woman, she's black, and she's somebody who we otherwise would identify and root for,
Yeah.
but we can't because of this. Is that a real thing? Did people just say, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein here and forget the Democrats?
Well, it doesn't look like Jill Stein got a whole lot of votes.
Yeah.
I think that there was an enthusiasm deficit in this, and it has to do with credibility. We just don't believe anybody anymore.
Mm.
We people go into office maybe when they run for their first term, as virgin candidates, they might have some degree of credibility, but in time they lose their credibility. And Jimmy Carter said it just a few years ago. He said, if you look at Congress, he said if anybody in Congress would speak up for Palestinians, it's unlikely that they'd ever be reelected. Now, listen, this is heartbreaking to me. I'm not, I'm not unaware of the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus has been unforgivably silent on genocide. It doesn't make sense. And just if you got a moment here,
Yeah.
just a year ago, just over a year ago, my wife Diane and I we were vacationing, and we went to Atlanta to experience Black history. The year before 2022, we went to Montgomery, Alabama. Well, last year we were in Atlanta. We went everywhere from Black-owned businesses to the Civil Rights Museum to Tyler Perry's studios, and just went all over town. But one of the things that was supposed to be the coup de grace was we attended Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Kings served for quite a few years. It's not the same building. They built a much larger facility across the street, but still it was important for us to experience that. And we were hoping that the Sunday that we went, that Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock would be on the program, and he was. Because of the size of the building, I couldn't take in the whole crowd, but I remember this moment when Pastor Warnock said, "We want to welcome some special guests here today. We have 3 busloads of representatives from synagogues, one from Daytona Beach, one from Palm Beach, and one from Palo Alto."
Mm.
Okay, so I didn't really give that a lot of thought, but I hadn't connected it. This was late October of 2023. It never crossed my mind in that moment that they might be there to police Senator Warnock. But I began to research his geopolitical positions. Before he ran for office, he was a strong voice for Palestinians.
Mm.
When he ran for Senate, crickets.
Mm.
But he's not the only one. There have been others, including Barack Obama, who pulled back, as you might say, pulled back the rhetoric, scaled back his language, and complied with the system because they know. I mean, look what happened to Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush. You speak up for Palestinians, and AIPAC, the American Israel Public Action Committee, is going to come for you, to the point that we just don't have credibility. Our society doesn't have credibility. Our politicians don't have credibility. So if somebody doesn't have credibility, it's going to be difficult for them to generate enthusiasm at a grassroots level for people to say, you know, I believe in this person because I believe this person.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. The credibility issue and the lack of enthusiasm in the campaign. Now, I talk to people in my field, in my life all the time, and it is very interesting the crickets, as you put it, around Gaza. Liberal, progressive, Democrat people. And then the conversation comes up, and all of a sudden, almost, I feel like they are there in their hearts intellectually too, but they don't go there because they're
Yeah.
so fearful of what that means for them and how they'll be perceived. And in some cases, it's just people on the street or it's politicians or even activists. And so there's that whole sense of fear of speaking what you might really think because of how you will be perceived.
Yeah.
And I think that, of course, that's what Kamala Harris did, in her big speech, right? She tried to play both sides, right? She said, we need to stop Hamas. We also need to stop, we have a ceasefire. We need a
Yeah.
ceasefire. So basically making no one happy and
Yeah.
making everyone upset by wanting everything instead of
Yeah.
taking a stand up. Dr. Moore, did you ever like Kamala Harris? Like, did you ever think, yeah, she's going to be a great president, or did you lack that enthusiasm yourself when she was the nominee?
Oh, I definitely lacked enthusiasm.
Yeah,
One of the things that if I found it an inspiration, and I'm on the board for the Planned Parenthood Central Coast Planned Parenthood Action Fund, and bodily autonomy for women and for all people, for people who identify as women and just humans in general, is a huge issue for me. When it comes to just being free. And I did not want Donald Trump to be president because of what he's already done to dismantle women's rights, with the Supreme Court picks. And it looks like it's very possible he'll get more picks, and that the Supreme Court will be in the hands of anti-choice people, a majority for perhaps a generation at least. I don't know. No, none of us can see the future. However, um, there are issues that I think that were important to me, where I had to, as people might say, look at the possible lesser of two evils in some way. I think a lot of people were that way, and even people who weren't completely cognizant of all of the issues were humans. Sometimes we can just intuit that this person is not being authentic with me, that this person is owned by somebody else, this person is being paid by someone else.
yeah. And that was sort of the vibe that a lot of people got with Kamala Harris, for sure. And it didn't help that she got put in that role at the last second, right?
Oh, yeah,
If
right,
Biden
right.
had stepped down and there was a whole nomination process, perhaps there may have been more time for her to appeal to people in a way that there was more authenticity as well. Let me ask you this question. How do we heal? How do we get along? How do we work together? There are people who are gloating, celebrating. We've already seen on social media an increase in like entitlement, when it comes to the things people say. We're probably going to see more acts of sexism, racism, all of those things, bigotry, because the president has gotten away with a lot of that, and he's the
Yeah,
president. And
yeah,
so people feel, well, of course I can do it as well. How do we how do we find common ground with conservatives, with people who are Trump
yeah.
supporters? How does that work? Because we don't want to live the next 4 years colliding, do we?
Right, right. I think it's imperative for people who are, never Trumpers and people who are anti-Trump and all of that to take a step back, um, because uh, we need to be aware that the folks who voted for Donald Trump and who are gloating right now, they're going to end up paying a price too. You
Mhm.
know, The last time he was in office, it was the price of an out of control pandemic that killed over 1 million people. You know, I mean, there's a long laundry list of things that impacted anybody who was not a billionaire. You know, just not being able to get toilet paper. But but if you're a billionaire, you're going to profit off of this. And so when it comes to gloating, um, I think it's tragic that we even are. I don't think that we should be reacting to the gloating. I think that's and I think that's counterproductive to be offended that, oh, how could somebody gloat over this? I think we should be feeling sorry for people because they're our fellow humanity and they're going to pay as much of a price as anybody else.
Mm. They just may not realize it yet, right?
They don't realize it.
This is a tough question, but do you think the Trump administration will be any better on Gaza than the Biden administration? Can we expect that there will be a change there at all, or will it get worse, or what do you think?
Okay, so Josh, I I think this idea that it keeps getting recited and has been being recited for decades. You hear politicians say it all the time, and not just politicians, but they say, "I believe in a two-state solution."
Yeah.
That's a deflection because Israel doesn't want a two-state solution.
Mhm.
So it's a deflection, and it's naive, and it's an imposition, um, and it's a tactic to to grant the capacity for Israel to expand. What's happening in the settlements in the West Bank is just small scale compared to what could happen beyond this. So there's no way that Donald Trump wants to rein this in. Um, because he's in it's not like he has that kind of control when he's in office.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the military industrial complex, but it's the military industrial complex in as much as it is in alliance with Zionism, with AIPAC, um, with a racist apartheid state, which again, as I said earlier, it reminds us of this society. It reminds us of the genocide that took place on this continent and the shame that goes with it. And you can't bomb away shame. You can drop 2,000 bombs there or anywhere else, and the shame will still be there, and it's going to generate more negative activity.
Let's pivot a little bit away from national politics, and talk a little bit, same sort of themes though, but locally. We had a local election, right, recently,
Yeah,
and we have things like rent control, which have become a dividing thing in the community. You've got property owners, landlords, housing providers, all kinds of terms that
yeah,
we use to describe them. And then we've got another effort to say, hey, let's cap rising rents. We've got rent evictions, property owners buy old Santa Barbara housing stock, evict people, give them tenant relocation assistance,
yeah.
but then raise the rents and they can never catch up because now they're paying four or five, $6,000 or whatever. And so it's a tense issue. Um, how do you weigh in on that issue of rent control when we have to live in a community, both
Yeah.
sides. Like you do have people who provide housing, and then you do
Yeah.
have people who are being kicked out and they have to leave the area. How do you bridge those two worlds? What are your views?
Josh, when I have to think about an issue and make sure I'm being informed, it is it is important for me to listen to the dispossessed. When it comes, on a global scale, I've got to hear the voice of Palestinians. In the same way that I listened to Black South Africans during apartheid, in the same way that I read what's happening to the Uyghurs, to the Rohingya, uh, wherever people to migrants trying to escape, be refugees into this. I listen to the dispossessed. Their voice is the important voice. People who are under distress, people who are living in a state of panic, they need to be heard because they don't operate media machines. They don't have access to the megaphones that some other people have. They don't have the money to put up the commercials. So I have been attending, I'm part of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, ACCE. It's about housing justice. And about 2 months ago, the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, attended our meeting. Now, this is all virtual, right? It's on Zoom. Um, and this Zoom is unlike any other Zoom that I attend. I mean, I've attended Zooms, with, 700, 800 people before, um, but not where more than half of the people are on cell phones because they're homeless, they're unhoused, they don't have, they're not carrying a laptop computer around. They're not sitting at a desk. They're using their phone. These are the people that I listen to. These are the people that, and these are the people who wanted Prop 33, which didn't pass because it didn't have, in my view, because it didn't have the funding. The thing is that this is simply how I try to nourish my moral center is to listen to the people who don't have access to media, who don't have, whose voices are unheard otherwise.
And so in the context of tenants, you obviously err on the side of, yeah, we need some sort of rent control, rent stabilization, because we
Yes.
know that so many people have been forced to leave the community.
Yeah.
We learned a lot about that. If you recall, we used to have a much larger Black population in Santa Barbara, and they were majority were driven out, and now we're seeing Latinos driven out, and this has historically been such
Yeah.
a large Latino Hispanic population, and we're seeing those numbers people who are moving to Oxnard, Ventura, and that sort
Yeah.
of thing because of rent issues. What do you say to a landlord? I talk to them, property owners, and they say, we're not getting rich here. It's like we can buy a property, it takes a long time, we have to get loans, we purchase financing. It's not as though we're going to become instant multimillionaires
Yeah.
because of this. We have to provide housing. If we don't provide it, who is, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. What would you say to sort of that attitude? That attitude is like, if it wasn't for us, there would be no housing.
Yeah. Well, one thing those owners and landlords are not, they're not homeless.
Yeah.
I mean, if if a person doesn't have a place to live, if a person is hungry, there's only one solution to their problem.
Yeah. So it's easy to take those kinds of approaches when you're in an air-conditioned room and you're well fed and you have options and choices. You
Yeah.
can have that intellectual debate, but people who don't have those options, that's where the need is.
Yeah.
And so, from a human rights perspective, that's where we need to be putting the focus on. Okay. I want to ask you about District 1 in Santa Barbara, and this is a very frustrating issue for me and situation because as a journalist, with district elections, we moved to district elections to have people who lived in the community represent us on the city council. We wanted to match the population, and the East Side, District 1, District 3, majority, minority districts. And so you got two strong Mexican American women running for office in this case. but it turned into a progressive versus conservative. It
Mm,
turned into a rent control versus not rent control. It turned into local versus not local, and it turned to who's going to work harder and who's been absent. And you saw a lot of the same themes that you see among people who are, different that we were trying to get away from when we were
yeah,
at-large elections. And now
yeah,
you've got two strong candidates running and they're still fighting.
yeah.
And so is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? In the big picture, we want strong people of color to serve in these seats.
Yeah.
However, clearly some people decided this is not the right person of color and this is the right person. And how do you how do we get through all of that while still making progress
Mm.
and not letting the bigger picture, the bigger enemy win?
Yeah, I think it's probably the kind of thing, and I could be wrong on this, but it's the kind of thing that we see often in much larger cities.
Hmm.
This is a an LA thing, a Dallas, a New York, Chicago kind of thing where people are, striving for power, no, by any means necessary, really, in some cases, because the stakes are so high. I don't necessarily know how high the stakes are in Santa Barbara for somebody running for city council. So I suspect there may be more to the story, that would distinguish this situation from, what happens in LA. But I do know that Wendy was more aggressive in her pursuit of the Planned Parenthood endorsement. Um, and for some people, that's, well, especially in this moment in history, that is the issue for a lot of people. So, I mean, I really can't say too much more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, let me go to say this is still a good thing. Is it still a net benefit? Because what happens, and I mean, I know this happens, is people say, oh, we never should have moved to district elections. We moved to district elections, and now they're fighting among themselves. And we should have just stayed how
Hmm.
it was.
Yeah.
And so, can you comment on that? Because the even among differences among people of color, and in this case, Mexican American women, them fighting, does that not still help those people who have been trying for years to maintain the power structure and status quo? Isn't that only help them in the long run? Or is it okay to have these little disputes on the city council because there's a net gain? We're still going to get progress.
Well, obviously, you want people in solidarity. You want people to be on the same page whenever you can. But if we didn't have districts, we wouldn't have, Oscar Gutierrez,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think he's a blessing to the city, but he would not be in office without having a district that he could focus on. So, that's, to me, that's one example of why it's important for us to have the districts. Maybe this is an unfortunate side effect. Maybe it's an anomaly. Maybe it's not. I just think that that Santa Barbara is too small for this to be a trend.
Hmm.
That it just needs to be worked out, though, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And Wendy did work. You say she sought the Planned Parenthood Action Fund endorsement, and in these local elections, wanting it and working for it
Yeah.
and trying, they matter. And you can't expect things to be bestowed upon you. You gotta work and you gotta knock on doors and you got.
Because we've heard this. I don't know if it's completely true, but everybody has their price. And I can't say that about any of the candidates, but I do know that the voting public realizes that we need people who are speaking for us at all times, and we don't need to be suspicious about it.
Right. So let me ask you a question about housing real quick, and then I want to go into you and your backstory and how you got to be here where you're at. Um, what is your solution to the housing crisis? Because we have the state who is forcing communities to build housing or incentivizing
Yeah,
developers and saying, "Hey, government, you have much less discretion on what to approve." And of course, in Santa Barbara, South Coast, Goleta, Carp, there's always pushback. Like, what about our unique charm? What about we don't have traffic? We don't have these things of the big city, and we want to keep it that way. We don't have a whole lot of land, right?
yeah.
There's some land that could be rezoned, but what is your solution to the housing crisis? Do we build it? Because if we, as I just did a story about these apartments on Anacapa and Gutierrez Street, Peter Lewis's apartments, and Solterra, a studio's 2,700, and then the most expensive two bedrooms like 6,500. There's huge range. I mean, building housing, we're building them for rich people still.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
what's your solution?
I think this is closely related to your question early on. How do we heal divides? And you know, healing divides um, requires more than a roundtable discussion. There's some real action that has to happen. We just we just have to recognize and again put get the information out in the open, which will be to the disadvantage of some people. Um, who owns the houses already? Who owns the apartment buildings? I mean, who who doesn't even live? Who doesn't even who maybe has never even visited Santa Barbara but owns multiple properties in town?
Mhm.
Um, to me, that's the problem. I think there just may be adequate housing in our community, but uh, people can't buy a house. I have adult kids, and the ones that are homeowners are not here. You know, uh, and I think that's pretty typical. That's pretty typical. That I mean, that's across the country, though. But especially on the coasts, people people can't buy a house. And one of the reasons they can't buy a house is that they are artificially, the prices are artificially, high, raised higher and higher.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's so much of the second homes, vacation homes, homes that just sit there, and people would rather have it sit there than rent it because they don't want to deal with, what type of people are going to be renting, or the vacation rental thing. They could make more money in a weekend than they can in a month, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And so that's a real issue. Dr. Moore, I want to talk to you about you and how you came to be who you are. I was looking at your background and your resume. You're a UCSB alum. You have a master's degree from St. Stephen's University in Canada, doctorate in theology, University of South Africa. Let's go back to the beginning. Like, where was David Moore? Where'd you get your start? Where were you born? What was life like for you as a kid?
Well, my dad was Navy, so we lived a few places,
Hmm.
but didn't travel like many Navy families. But I was born in Albuquerque, but I couldn't tell you much about Albuquerque because I was just over 2 years old when we relocated to Oxnard and then to San Francisco and eventually back to Oxnard. And I attended Channel Islands High School and from there came to UC Santa Barbara. Um, it's it's uh, it's interesting how I came to be where I am in life. When when I was uh, when I was 17 years old and I started at UCSB, um, I was influenced by, I would listen to Dick Gregory LPs. I don't know if you remember Dick Gregory.
I remember him. I mean, yeah, he's a very cool dude, and has a lot of views on things. Yeah, passed away since, but yeah.
So anyway, I was inspired by him, even though I
Yeah.
had, classes in school and everything. I listened to him I listened to the music, Curtis Mayfield and the Last Poets and Marvin Gaye. Um, these people were shaping a political mindset for me. So while I was at UCSB, when I turned 18, I did not, I did not, I did not enter the draft. Um, I just didn't see the point. And listen, I was not from I wasn't from a family that really talked about politics all the time. In fact, I knew very little about Martin Luther King uh, growing up, but I did know about Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali because he was on TV on the West Coast more than King was, right?
Right.
I mean, Wide World of Sports and all of that. And I just thought, wow, man, that's somebody I could look up to. He fed my soul,
Yeah.
right? So anyway, by the time I turned 18, I wasn't gonna register for the draft. I didn't see the point of the war. I didn't get it, and I had not heard Dr. King's speech, against Vietnam or anything like that. I was influenced by Muhammad Ali
Hmm.
and people like him, right? And then when it came time for me to register to vote for the first time, I registered. I wrote in Black Panther Party. Um, so that's where I was in that moment. But then I became part of church, right? And honestly, church neutered me, um, distracted me from many of the things that I mean, I was helped too. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't have been doing it if I didn't get some benefit. But politically, it neutered me, and it took me years to recover from that. But I always had questions in my mind, like, why do people do this? Why do churches do that? Why does Christianity? This doesn't seem like Jesus. I mean, I kept growing, and so in time, um, I was radicalized by our society.
Yeah, you mentioned Muhammad Ali was my father, when I grew up. I mean, he was our his hero, his leader. We had the posters. I watched all the fights. I've seen every, Cassius Clay video on YouTube that exists, and then of course Muhammad Ali. And it's crazy the amount of crossover appeal he had to
Yeah,
uh obviously people of color, but anyone who
yeah.
was
In
feeling
the
a sense of
struggle.
injustice in the
Yes.
world. And
Yeah.
that was it, and
Yeah.
and then of course he's so smart, he's such a good writer and poet, and he could do his little, he could predict knockouts to a rhyme, and it would come true some of the times. And so I can definitely relate to that as a little kid, watching my dad would get together in his garage with the closed circuit TV, and watch the fights and all of his friends. Um, and so that's definitely a real thing. You mentioned church neutered you. What kind of a church was it? A Christian church,
Yeah,
evangelical?
yeah, yeah. It was all of the above. I mean, I grew up going to black churches. There were, I mean, there were so many beautiful experiences because it was community. I mean, we ate together, we encouraged. The thing about the black church is that if you're not in the South, then during my growing up period, then your church was a colony of the South,
Mm.
right? Because of the Great Migration. My parents were part of the Great Migration. So whether you were in Chicago or, Seattle or New York City or Los Angeles or the California Central Coast, uh, or Southern California, your church, a black church, was a colony of the South, and the preachers were, uh, you know, probably from Little Rock or from Atlanta, Birmingham, that kind of thing. So we were influenced by Southern culture, even though we never lived there. And so there was something positive about that because we had to learn to be skeptical about systems because they definitely were exposed to the brutality of systems. But on the other hand, we were told, in a way, many of us, I can't say this is true for everybody because I know that it's not, but by and large, we were taught a Christianity that said you got to keep your head down, you know, just keep plugging away, do your best. But we were largely silent,
Mhm.
and I can't, the sense of my sense for justice kept bubbling up in me, and to the point that it broke through, and I became an activist. But part of the problem too for me is I came to Santa Barbara, and I was influenced in Santa Barbara more by white evangelical and Pentecostal churches because they're more numerous. And that's where the real neutering took place. I mean, as much as anything. I didn't realize that it was like they were holding a carrot out in front of me because, they talked about racial justice and healing and reconciliation, but they kept moving the carrot, or moving the goalposts or whatever. I never really saw much significant change in them. So when MAGA, well, no, before MAGA, but when, the Tea Party and all of that stuff started happening, these churches found a refuge. Many of them, they found a refuge. Not everybody in the churches, but enough of a proportion of the constituencies identified with the Tea Party, identified with Obama is a Muslim. I mean, Salem Broadcasting, which is a network of Christian radio stations, was big especially in Ventura County because the signal was stronger than in Santa Barbara. But they influenced. They had Charlie Kirk and that attorney that worked for Trump, Jay Sekulow. All these people had programs and under the name of Christianity,
Mhm.
right? And so people were going to church with this trash in their brains. And it was then where I had to fish or cut bait, and I just said, no, I can't deal with this. This is a bunch of BS.
Yeah. And you spent some time in South Africa, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
what did you learn there? How was your life changed by and what era, what period were you there?
I was never there for a long period, but I've been there, I think, 14 times. And I was impacted by um, well, first of all, when I was there, because I haven't been there for several years now, but when I was there, I was impacted by the intelligence of the university students um, that I spent time with, and the high school students who didn't have access to books. So I started a book project, and I would get books, people to donate money to buy books and get them into schools because I went to secondary schools, which are high schools, and the only books they had access to were the ones on campus. So people went home, they had no books. So I wanted to do something about that and did do something about that. That was really important to me because they had a voracious appetite to learn. They were not interested in video games at that time. I don't know if that's still the case, but when I was there, they were not interested. They wanted books. They wanted to read. So that I was really impressed by their desire to learn and to read and their high level of intelligence. And one conversation just stays with me. I was sitting in a room with a group of university students, University of Cape Town, and I was talking with these people who were like between the ages of 18 and 22, and I brought up how the world looks at African countries and the lack of infrastructure and as they call it, banana republics, and how people get in office and they don't want to leave, and all this kind of stuff. And I remember I brought that up with these students, and I remember one of them, with the support of all the other students, he said, "At least now you are paying attention." And what he was referring to is as long as the colonial powers were crushing them, the world turned a blind eye to what was going on the continent. So he says, at least now you are paying attention. And that has stayed with me, that people only seem to want to pay attention to countries in crisis during their crisis, when you can bring up Haiti or Congo, DRC or whatever. People are always asking the question, why can't they get their act together? Right now, the question is Cuba. Why can't Cuba get their act together? Why does the power grid keep failing? Well, I can tell you why the power grid keeps failing. It's because the U.S. has an embargo on, is blockading Cuba and keeping it in the 1950s. And while that goes on, the UN keeps urging for change. The UN multiple times has voted to end the embargo, the U.S. embargo on Cuba. The vote ends up being typically something like 145 to 2, 159 to 2. And you know what the two are? The US and Israel. This alliance, this unholy alliance that seems to find a way to justify all of its behaviors. It needs to be broken. This cartel needs to be broken up.
Yeah. We tend to care about the problem when it's at its worst, when it's at its height, and we look at it and say, "Wow, look how bad it is," but not the situations that happened that led up to that and why it definitely exists. Your your activism, right? You this when you decided I'm leaving the church to because I'm tired of putting my head down and just getting along and being conservative. It's exactly
Yeah.
what conservatism is. Um, Once you did that, right? How did that change you and your
Yeah.
life and everything? I mean, you've got kids. Once you were able to sort of say, this is my calling. Talk to me a little bit about how that affected your overall life and your choices and what you were doing in Santa Barbara.
Okay, just a point of clarification. I did not leave. They left me.
Okay. All right.
Slowly but surely, they just didn't want to be around, me and what I represented. But I never made a conscious decision to say, I'm not going back to this or I'm not attending that anymore. It was more like, wow, it's pretty clear that they don't want me around. So there's that. Um, but I got to tell you that it brought me into greater favor with people my kids' age and their
Mm,
generation.
mm,
I think that one of the big divides that we experience in society um, is when older people become acclimated to things that seem to be unchanging or unchangeable in their perception systemically. When younger people, I don't know if you know who Linga Kikovics is, but she lives in Oxnard. She's an author. Anyway, she's indigenous Guatemalan,
mm.
and we had a conversation recently, and Linda likes to talk about building a new society, a better world. So I said, Linda, how do we do that? And she says, we have to make the way the world looks now looks strange. And for younger people, they don't need to be sold on that. I mean, this stuff looks weird. I mean, you know, having metal detectors in school and prioritizing gun rights over kids' lives. We've seen Uvalde, we've seen Sandy Hook, we've seen Parkland, we've seen all of these things happen. And when you're older, you're like, oh, wow, this is the way the world is. But when you're 14 years old, you can't accept this. And so we've got to, when you're a mature person and you don't have mentors who are 14 or 23, when you're not in conversation with these folks, then you calcify and you become hardened. You even become hateful. And this is the problem we're dealing with. If we want healing in our society, we're going to have to listen to the voices of the dispossessed and with younger people. We've got to listen. We've got to stop complaining about people wanting to use their pronouns, whining. Like, that's a big issue. Like, what's it to you? I mean, why is this a problem to you? If a person, younger people have less of an issue with this. And we need to listen to the broadness of thinking and articulation that comes from them.
Yeah.
I am in greater solidarity with people half my age and younger than many people who are my age.
Yeah. Because people your age and older, they say you're to the left, right? Or you're too out, you're troublemaker, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah, so you get that whole thing. Whereas young people say, that's exactly where we should be. We need
yeah,
more of that,
yeah.
and that's the divide. Do you remember Babatunde Folayemi? Did you
Oh
know?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We hosted him. He spoke. We had a dinner once, and yeah, I remember him. He was a much loved person, and on the East Side especially, right?
Yeah. Well, I covered him early in my career, and I always think of him because he was one of these people who he was an East Side guy, right? Like if we had a city council election, he'd win. And of course, he did serve on the city council, um, but I always feel like he was a guy who was a healer, right? People, even if they didn't like him very much or they didn't agree
Yeah,
with his politics, you couldn't
yeah.
help but be warm around him because he would bring that out of you. How do we cultivate sort of, you're a community leader, obviously. How do we cultivate that next generation of leaders who can stay here, who can afford to live here, who aren't going to
Mm.
move out when they're 30 or something, when they want to settle down? You work with young people. How do we do that so we have a more youthful future here in Santa Barbara?
Wow, Josh, if I had the answer to that, my kids would be living here. Well, I don't know for sure. Maybe they wouldn't.
Yeah.
I know professionally, at least two of them would not be. They'd have to be away. But the thing is that it's just not easy to live here, and this is the byproduct of hypercapitalism, right? Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, other than actually the same answer to the problem with housing. It's the same issue, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So we'll wrap up here in a few minutes, Dr. Moore. But going forward, what are your goals in 2025? What sort of conversations do you want to be part of, and what sort of change do you want to make? You obviously are so connected and involved, and you're everywhere. But
Yeah.
what are you looking at in the next year in terms of your activism?
I think, Josh, that we we need some moral clarity. Um, and in order to achieve that, we have to look inside. We have to look at ourselves, not just people who we're in solidarity with or people who we're opposing or who are opposing us. We have to look inside ourselves. Back in 2016 or 17, I read Naomi Klein's book, No is Not Enough. And at the end of the book, she urges all the readers to tackle, to even kill your inner Trump. All right. I don't think that has happened. I even think, and I run the risk here of leveling blame, and it's not my intention here or causing or creating an atmosphere of self blame. But I think that even people who could see this picture of what the threat that we're living under or about to live under in greater measure, I I think many of us need to take a look at ourselves. I think that we need to uh, listen. I'm so glad that Trump didn't, that the assassination attempts didn't work, because we don't need to kill the outer Trump. We need to kill the inner Trump. The the outer Trump will just keep creating itself, because something else Naomi Klein said. Donald Trump may seem like he's an extreme example or bizarre, but he's actually the natural consequence of what a society that idolizes wealth, that idolizes power. We should have a Trump in her estimation. I mean, I'm not saying we should have because we need it, but what I mean is that this is the product. We created this as a society. And again, I don't want anybody to, put blame on themselves, but I think that individually and collectively, we need to look within. We need to, find out what qualities, what lack of qualities any of us may have, and deal with that so that we can communicate better.
Yeah, that's good advice. Look within because you can't change other people, right? But you can change yourself.
Yeah.
If you change yourself, and we all work on that, then we find common ground. But I think you're right. I think it's so many people spend so much time saying, you're the problem. You need to do this, you need to do this. And even if they do need to do that, no one likes being told that,
Right,
You
right.
just got to find your inner stuff that you wrestle with, that you're dealing with, and that's a lot of the work that everyone needs to do. But I appreciate your time, Dr.
Okay,
Moore.
one more thing before
Go
we
ahead. Yeah.
stop,
Yeah.
because I know you do too. I want in on a high note.
Yes.
I think that if we do look within, that we'll find solutions. I I think that if we look, in fact, I think that's the only place we're going to find solutions. And I think that we are set up. Yeah, I know what happened in the previous Trump administration, and it was almost like the end of the world in some ways. And I know that we're poised to go there, and perhaps um, to a greater extreme than before, um, with even more chaos. I know that's possible, but I also know that this is an inflection point. And if we will not react to everything, but if we will be thoughtful and incisive and meditative, I think that our activism will carry more weight. Our voice will have more weight when we are more thoughtful. And I think we can really actually come to the place where we start to build something new and better.
Perfect. That's a great way to end the show, Dr. Moore. Thank you so much. It's been very enlightening, and I appreciate your time and perspectives and getting to talk to you about all these important issues. So let's do it again down the road.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Have a great day. Take care.
All right, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you.